The History of Poland, Episode 23, Pomerania, Part 1. Sometimes when we talk about history, we end up finding connections between events that we never expected. A merchant ship lands on the Mediterranean shores of Europe and deposits a disease that will someday wipe out half the population of the Kingdom of England. Or we could point to the physical locations of laboratories in the Third Reich, which partially informed if leading physicists and rocket scientists would end up working for the Soviet Union or for the United States during the Cold War. There are tens of thousands of these types of examples throughout history, beyond all recounting. That's as true in Poland as it is in any other place on this earth. For today's discussion, as we begin our journey into Pomerania and the early history thereof, we're going to focus on two. The first example is a leader of clergy launching a war to retake Jerusalem, which went on to impact the lives of people in Pomerania that may never have even heard of the Pope. The second is how swampland can push the direction of a country in ways few could have foreseen. Let's start with the swamps. I've been in a few, and one in particular comes to mind, the Everglades in Florida. This won't come as news to anyone that personally knows me, but I'm generally not a fan of the geography or natural characteristics of Florida. That is doubly true of the Everglades. Don't get me wrong, from the safe distance of thousands of miles, I love the Everglades. They provide many benefits to the world, it's a habitat for endangered species, it does wonders for the stability of the world environment, and is remarkable in the abstract. Yet, from the abbreviated time I spent either on a boat in the Everglades or driving across it, one thing became clear. It wasn't a place that I envisioned spending an extended period of time in. The swampiness of it all felt like if I had stepped out of the boat, I would be sucked down into the murky waters, with unknown creatures around and with no help to pull me back out. A disturbing picture. But you're probably wondering, what does this disturbing picture have to do with Poland? Well, swamps are all over this wide world, and that's especially true in Poland of the 12th century. One area in particular that was well known for its swampy character was Pomerania. Yes, the strip of land to the north of the territory of the Piast, previously conquered by Mieszko, then in a constant state of rebellion, raiding, conquest, and insurrection. The land was plagued with swamps. That swampiness I just described, that was Pomerania. I did spend a considerable amount of time trying to find a map of the area that indicated which parts were more swampy than the others, but I couldn't find one. What I did find, though, is that in pretty much every source document or historical analysis on Pomerania during this time, the swamps made an appearance. Words of swamps, marshes, wetlands, rivers, streams, muddy flats, and more. While I don't have a map to prove it, the impression I get is that the entire place was a swamp. Now, while I've spent time telling you that Pomerania was rebelling or being invaded over the last few dozen episodes of this podcast, I realized recently that I never explained why it was so difficult for the Piast monarchy to hold on to the lands. After all, they didn't face such problems in all of the other territories they accumulated or conquered. There are innumerable pieces to this puzzle, but one at the center of them all was the geography of Pomerania. To understand why, let's look at 4 theoretical situations and how that geography, and specifically the swampiness, played into them. The first situation. Let's say you're the Duke of Poland. You've got your typical enemies arranged about you. One of them invades. It doesn't really matter which, since this is a hypothetical after all. Could be the Emperor, the Czechs, the Hungarians, or in a fun twist, it could be the Rus. Regardless of who it is, there's one thing that they all have in common. They're in the opposite direction of Pomerania. So you have to focus your attention on that imminent threat and take your full attention away from expanding into Pomerania. That would normally be fine, since you can leave it on the back burner, so to speak. But then the Pomeranians remember something. They remember that it takes a long time to travel across their lands due to the swamps, so if you're off on the border fighting an enemy, they have a chance to rebel, overthrow whichever noble you've put over them, and then take shelter in the swampiness of their native lands. By the time the fighting is over, they may not be independent per se, but they've at least bought themselves 6 months to a few years of nominal self-rule. So that's scenario number 1. The second scenario. Let's say that you've installed someone loyal to you as the Lord of Pomerania, or a large section of it. Their family may be married into your family, you may have been their benefactor during their rise through the political ranks, or you might have just seen eye to eye on the issues of the day. As a reward for their faithful service, you give them lands and title in Pomerania. In exchange, you ask the same thing of them that you ask of all of your vassals. They send you a portion of their revenues, you can call them up for military service if the need arises, they'll host you and your retinue if you tour through the area, they'll help in any missionary activities, and in a very general sense, they'll do what you say. This trade works great in most areas, and you assume it'll work fine in Pomerania. So your pick of new noble goes up to Pomerania, likely as part of your initial invasion force, and sets up shop. They're pretty excited about having this land and getting to know the people and promulgating their ideas and implementing their plans. They're also excited about the money they're going to make. Who wouldn't be? Pomerania was a rich land, and the good times they're imagining. Yet, as time goes on, they realize that the trade they were in favor of isn't all that great. Sure, they're theoretically under the protection of their overlord, but this new vassal is doing all the grunt work. They're the ones managing the lands, doing the hard labor, hosting missionaries that you're sending while paying their expenses out of their own pocket. Finally, they realize there's nothing stopping them from simply switching sides, or even switching to a new side, their own. After all, they've got to know these Pomeranian locals, and they're not all that bad. With much thought, they stop sending money south, and they quietly stop responding to your messages. Unfortunately for you, the only way to mitigate this betrayal is to invade once again. That's an unplanned incursion, which means you need to gather resources, money, and manpower to go and invade a territory you thought you'd already conquered. Years lost, once again, while Pomeranian culture and religion continues with its independent streak. The next scenario is related to trade, which unsurprisingly follows a familiar pattern. As the new overlord and conqueror of Pomerania, you decide that you want to increase trade through the area. This is only natural, what with these paths to the sea and the great opportunity that lies at your doorstep. But with the swampy landscape and the locals being hostile, you find that protecting merchants proves to be a bit more difficult than originally anticipated. Merchants aren't happy about being forced to provide their own protection, so they try to dodge taxes. With revenues drying up, overseeing the Pomeranian lands becomes less and less feasible. To fix the situation, you'd need to really invest heavily in making this a first-class territory. Instead of making money, you're pouring it in, and it's getting sucked up in the mud. For our final hypothetical scenario, there's the idea of Christianization. This should come as little surprise to most people, but when you hold a sword to someone's throat and tell them to convert, many people will say what they need to survive. Then once you're gone, they'll go right back to their old ways. You can't hold a sword to somebody's throat their entire life. Those statues you ordered destroyed? Well, funny story, they were actually just buried. What about those temples that you had converted into churches? Well, new symbols can be taken off the wall just the same as the old ones. And with wetlands separating you from your new subjects, those centers of worship are erected once more. This slows the process of Christianization that you envisioned, and this process, which is typically a proxy for assimilating new subjects into your culture, enforcing your laws, and making a group of people part of your medieval European state, grinds to a halt. To change this situation, you need to send up some capable missionaries. But unsurprisingly, and as we'll talk about in an upcoming episode, people aren't really thrilled with the prospect of spending time dealing with the peculiarities of Pomeranian geography or politics, especially when there are much richer and more glory-filled areas to evangelize. In all of these situations, there isn't an easy answer. In fact, the answer seems to be that the only way to really hold on to Pomerania is to really focus on it for a long stretch of time. Not just a relatively quick invasion and nominal takeover like with Mieszko I. No. An invasion and conquest that lasts for years, that takes into account not just the military dominance of the Poles, but also the cultural and religious warfare that needs to take place. This is the situation that Boleslav has found himself in at this point in our story. He's in need of a justification that will allow him to conquer these lands, install rulers who will faithfully represent the interests of the Piast, and finally bring stability to the region. Not at all coincidentally, we're now going to talk about crusades. Yeah, that's one smooth segue you just heard. We've really only mentioned crusades once or twice on the show so far, just to note that the crusades had been launched, but a lot has happened in that time, and it's time to catch up on world affairs. Which brings us to one of the trickier parts of telling a story about the history of Poland. One struggle that I've always found is the question of how much context is enough. We're all familiar with the idea that in order to understand event B, we first need to go back and understand event A. But of course, it's equally true that to understand event A, we need to go back further in time. The problem with this, naturally, is that there's no stopping point, which leads to the difficulty of telling anything about history at all without going all the way back to the Bronze Age. All of that is to say that we need to talk about the Crusades. Yet we really don't want to get bogged down in the weeds of the Crusades. Just enough to give us the context we need to understand what's going on in Poland. For our brief summary, though, we'll discuss two things. First, how did this crusade thing get started? And second, what are the Crusades? This will then lead into a discussion of how Poland interacted with the early Crusades. To begin, we're going to turn to Professor Christopher Tyerman, the professor of history of the Crusades at the University of Oxford's Hertford College. Tyerman has published extensively on the Crusades, and for a subject that is still strangely controversial in modern times, I hope we can all agree that his introduction to the topic is unimpeachable, or at least as close to that as we can get. This introduction comes courtesy of his book, Fighting for Christendom, Holy War, and the Crusades. It's a bit of a lengthy excerpt from the book, but it really does do a good job of introducing the subject. Tyerman tells us that, quote, at a council of the church held at Clermont in the French Auvergne in November 1095, a decree was issued that marked a new beginning in Western Christianity's use of war to further its religious mission. Whoever, for devotion alone, not to gain honor or money, goes to Jerusalem to liberate the Church of God, can substitute this journey for all penance. This decree did not invent Christian violence, nor did it define precise terms of a revolution in thought or practice, or determine how future generations would employ the precedent. Coming halfway through a preaching tour of France conducted by Pope Urban II, the Clermont Assembly was best remembered not for the legal authority granted by the decree, but for the Pope's sermon at the end of the council on the 27th of November. What the Pope said is not known. Witnesses and later commentators subsequently depicted him as delivering a rousing call to arms to the fighting classes of Western Europe to recover the holy city of Jerusalem, insisting that this was no ordinary act of temporal warfare, but a task enjoined on the faithful by God himself, a message echoed back in the cries of Deus lo vult, God wills it, said to have greeted Urban's words. To provide a focus for commitment and a sign of distinction, Urban instituted the ceremonial granting of crosses to those who had sworn to undertake the Jerusalem journey. Thus, they became signed with the cross, crucignati. Jumping forward a bit, Tyerman continues, saying, quote, the memory of Urban's rhetoric at Clermont played a central role in how the events prompted by his speech were later portrayed, providing a convenient start to narratives of the startling consequences of the Pope's preaching. Urban's decree explicitly proclaimed a holy war in which the effort of the campaign, including the fighting and the inevitable slaughter, could be regarded as equivalent to strenuous performance of penance provided it had been undertaken devoutly. The cause may have been seen as just, but that was not the point. This was an act of total self-abnegating faith demanded by God, hence the language of unrealistic absolutes that failed to match military, social, and psychological reality, an ideal to inspire and against which deeds could be judged. The Clermont Decree instituted a holy war, its cause and motive religious, an act of Christian charity for the love of God and their neighbor, the Eastern Christians. As well as combining violence with a transcendent moral imperative, Urban appealed to a form of primitive religious nostalgia embodied in the ambiguously liminal Holy City of Jerusalem, lost to Christendom since its capture by the Muslims in 638, yet central to Christian imagination as the scene of the crucifixion and resurrection. Here, according to Christian texts familiar through the Mass and liturgy, earth touched heaven. In a short space, the Clermont Decree identified reasons for the massive response: the certainties of faith, fear of damnation, temporal self-image, material, social, and supernatural profit, the attraction of warfare for a military aristocracy, an unequivocally good cause, and an iconic objective of loud resonance in the imaginative world of Western Christians. It proved to be a formula of sustained power for the rest of the Middle Ages. End quote. So that answers the first question of how the Crusades began. They began at the instigation of Pope Urban II due to a multitude of internal, external, and theological reasons that I won't go deeper into for now. Which then leads us to the second question: what are the Crusades? Returning to Tyerman's summary, he tells us that, quote, what we today call a crusade could be described as a war answering God's command, authorized by a legitimate authority, the Pope, who, by virtue of the power seen as vested in him as Vicar of Christ, identified the war's object and offered to those who undertook it full remission of the penalties of confessed sins and a package of related temporal privileges, including church protection of family and property, immunity from lawsuits, and interest for payments on debt. The beneficiary earned these grants by swearing a vow, symbolized in a ritual adoption of a cross, blessed by a priest and worn on the recipient's clothing, the vow often being couched in terms parallel to those for a pilgrimage. The duration of the spiritual and temporal privileges was determined by the fulfillment of the vow, by absolution, or by death. those dying in battle or otherwise in fulfillment of their vow could expect eternal salvation and to be regarded as martyrs. At every stage, analogies with a quasi-monastic commitment were drawn, associating the activity with what remained the ideal conception of the perfect Christian spiritual life. Although details of the operation of the vow and its associated privileges developed over the following century or more to cover a multiplicity of political and ecclesiastical concerns, the first appearance and original justification for such a holy war in 1095 was the recovery of Jerusalem from Muslim rule. Thereafter, the Holy Land retained a primacy in rhetoric, imagination, and for many centuries, ideology." End quote. That then tidily answers our second question. But now we get to the real meat of the issue. It's one thing to understand the Crusades, what they were, and how they got started. But for this podcast, we need to understand Poland's relationship with the early Crusades, what role it played, if any, and what that has to do with Pomerania. After all, this episode is Pomerania, Part 1. This is where we're really going to understand the impact of unintended consequences. We've understood the swamps, we understand the basics of the Crusade, but how do we connect to our story? After all, the Crusades were focused on Jerusalem, which hopefully, as most of us know, is nowhere near Poland or Pomerania. Well, this is such a great line of inquiry that we're going to talk about it in our next episode. Yes, I'm sorry to leave this as a cliffhanger, but such is life. Tune in next time, which will be very soon indeed if you're listening and the next episode isn't available yet, and hear all about Poland and Holy War. As always, thank you for listening. If you'd like to help support the creation of this podcast, you can donate at patreon.com/historyofpolandpodcast. If you can't spare the change, you can always leave a review on the various podcast apps for free, or follow along on both Twitter and Facebook by searching for the History of Poland podcast. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.